Hello everybody and welcome back. This week we're going to talk about some cool weapon effects that you can use on all of your minis. Bolting right out of the gate, we're going to go straight into how you can get a really nice saturated power sword effect. I'm doing a blue one here, but you can use any colour you like and the same techniques will apply. We're going to be using contrast paints for this because they're really high in saturation, so we're going to start with a base coat of pale grey blue. You can use any grey or white that you like here, but pale grey blue has really nice coverage, so I'm using this as my base layer. Now, as I alluded to earlier, once that's dry I'm going to use contrast paints. I'm using Achillean green, which is a great base layer for this. The contrast paint is going to naturally pool, forming some highlights and shadows all over the blade, and that's going to inform our highlight layers. Now my camera had some focus issues here, so we're going to quickly talk through what happened in between. With how the contrast paint dried, I already had some natural highlights, so I filled those in with Araman blue and then filled in a smaller area with Temple Guard blue. The technique for doing this is quite simple, and I can show you that now with Baharoth blue, which is my third highlight layer. The initial highlights are marked out by where the contrast paint is dark versus light, and I just fill that area in, getting smaller every time. By the time we've got to this paint, it's a really small amount that we're covering off. And that informs our next layer, which is either a grey or a white. I'm going back to pale grey blue. These are going to be our really bright highlights. Generally, I'm adding little scratches and those really bright reflections that you see on a sword. I'm also adding an edge highlight all the way around, which really brightens up everything. After this is all done, it's just a bit of a tidy up, going back in with thinned down Achillean green from our base layer and tidying up any areas I've gone over with the highlights and helping those blends a tad. And with our tidy up complete, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. So that's a really nice saturated power sword that can be done very quickly. Now, let's move on to some muzzle burn. Loads of weapons have muzzle burn, and I'm using a flamer here to show it off, but it works on melters too. The first thing to do is paint it in a metallic colour and then wash with Nuln oil, or any other black shade that you have. Once that's dry, we're going to cover a healthy area with Skeleton Horde. You can also use Citadel Seraphim Sepia or any other sepia paint here. I'm just using Skeleton Horde because it covers better than a lot of shades. I'm covering about 3/4 of the barrel, as I'm going to be adding a lot more layers and I want this to still show. Now over about 2/3 of the Skeleton Horde, we're going to use a brown wash, in this case Agrak's Earthshade. You really want to make sure that every layer is fully dry before you add the next wash, otherwise you'll be picking up loads of paint with each brushstroke. Same deal over a smaller area, we're adding Druchii Violet, which is really going to add a nice accent to our muzzle burn. The final step is Drakenhof Nightshade, which adds a nice blue tinge to the end. You can also add a bit of black if you want, but I didn't here and I think it looks perfect. And honestly, the longest part of this is the drying time. Next up, one of my personal favourite effects, Molten Weapons. This is such a cool way to make a unique looking weapon, and it works great for armies like Salamanders or Leagues of Votann. Starting off with a base coat of red, any red will do. I'm using Mephiston red here because it has good coverage, but any bright red is perfect. Next, we're going to fill out a small channel in the middle with Evil Sun Scarlet, or any slightly brighter red. Next up is the transition from red to orange, and I'm using Wild Rider red here for that. Every step of this process is pretty much the same. We're just going to be filling in that channel in the centre with smaller and smaller areas of coverage. It's slightly time consuming as you wait for stuff to dry, but it makes a really cool gradient at the end without too much effort. Once that's dry, we're going to transition to full orange. Any high pigment orange will do here because we want a good base coat before we go in with our slightly thinner colours, in this case yellow. I'm using Avalan Sunset as my first yellow as it covers fairly well, especially for a Citadel yellow. But if you have any high pigment yellows, this is the perfect time for that. The next step is a slightly brighter yellow, and you can do this by mixing your base yellow with white, or just have a layer paint like I'm using here. Flash gets yellow, it's only for a tiny amount of the blade anyway, so don't worry if it's a little bit thin. The final highlight layer is Screaming Skull. Pale sand will also work, or any off-white paint you fancy. This gives a really cool glowing molten core effect. Now the step that's going to really sell this effect is by adding some flecks of molten metal all over the sword. You can do this with a black paint. I'm using Black Legion as it's a really good one coat black, but any black will do, and you don't even need to do this method. I'm using a fairly careful edge highlighting / chipping effect, but there's actually a better way to do this in just a second. A quick highlight with a light grey will really show off that the sword still has an edge. On larger surfaces, you can also use this colour to add a few more flecks. Then to help with the glow towards the base of the weapon where the power source is, I'm using a little glaze of Imperial Fist. You really don't need to do this, it's very subtle, and if you're doing a batch paint job, it's not really worthwhile, but on a character, it's a very cool effect. Now, as I alluded to, there is a slightly better method of adding the molten flecks, and I think it looks better as well in this situation. Take a dry brush, I'm using a makeup brush, and put black on it. Get rid of most of the black, and then stab it over the sword. It might be a tiny bit messy, but so's molten metal. I find that it gives a much more natural look to the effect that we're creating, and it's really quick and easy, so if you are doing those batch paint jobs, this is the way to go. This same method can work for any molten weapon. They don't even need to be this colour, they can be blues or greens with a molten effect. You just do the same layer method with a bright core and then stab on some black, and you end up with something as cool as this. The final effect is plasma. Now I've chosen to go for a green colour scheme because we've already seen some blue, and it's just to prove it can work with any colours. Same as the sword in the first part of this video, we're going to base coat with a grey or white. Next up, looking for that easy saturation, we're going to use Warp Lightning, which is a green contrast paint. Again, any red, blue, purple, yellow, go wild with your plasma, it'll work here. It's also worth filling in these vents at the front of the weapon because it really adds to the effect. Once all that's dry, I'm going in with a chunky highlight of a brighter green all around the edges of the plasma coils. This is because the energy is coming from inside the weapon, so I want it to appear like a rudimentary glow effect. I wouldn't recommend going too thin with your highlights here, keep them chunky because you want to have some transition when you come to do the next layers. One thing I like to do with plasma is create a rudimentary object source lighting effect. You can of course do this with an airbrush or tons of glazes, but a really quick way to do it is an edge highlight of your glowing colour around the plasma coil. So onto the black casing here, I'm using Moot Green, my brighter green, to create a chunky edge highlight. It's not the neatest in the world, but when you're looking at it from about a meter away, it really looks like a glow effect. With our Moot Green layer done, we're going in with an even brighter highlight. This is Livery Green, and I'm going to fill in all the areas I've already covered. We'll need a bit more brush control here as we want to keep this highlight ever so slightly thinner. My paint's quite thin, but not to the extent that it's watery. We've already created the guidelines for where we're going to be painting, there's nothing new here. We're going to continue filling out the vents and also add one more thin highlight all the way around the casing. This will just accent that glow effect that we covered off earlier and really help sell it as a very powerful, bright weapon. Final highlight on this weapon is to take our original base colour, or any grey or white, and add in a really bright thin highlight all the way around the edges. We don't want this one on the casing, so do be careful. This is really very thin to allow it to run into the recesses between the casing and the plasma coil. Once we've filled in all those areas, you should end up with a plasma weapon that looks like this. This video was all about making eye-catching weapons and spot colours look the part on your model in a really simple way. If you'd like to see more videos like this, then do let me know. These have been the subjects of our video. I've been Sam. See you next time.